When palace insiders leaked that Queen Camilla had been airbrushed out of a newly commissioned royal portrait, the nation was stunned. But for Camilla, this wasn't just a revision of history, it was a dagger to the heart. The portrait was supposed to be a grand tribute, a visual hallmark of King Charles's reign and the monarchy's new chapter after the coronation. Commissioned months earlier, it was to hang in the royal gallery, flanked by works of former sovereigns and royal consorts. But what made this piece different was the promise of unity. It was meant to portray Charles, Camilla, and the senior royals standing together as a symbol of continuity and stability. Camilla herself had been present at the initial sitting, spending hours beside her husband, offering poses, suggestions, even reviewing sketches. She had been assured personally and publicly that this image would feature her alongside Charles, immortalized as Queen Consort. So when word spread that the final version excluded her entirely, shock rippled through royal circles like an earthquake. At first, the whispers seemed implausible, surely a mistake, a rumor, or a misinterpretation of a different work in progress. But the leak was confirmed by a palace aide who had seen the painting in its final form. Camilla was gone, removed, not faded into the background or framed as a supporting figure but erased, as if she had never been meant to be there at all. Inside the palace, confusion quickly gave way to speculation. Was this a last-minute artistic decision? Or something darker, a message disguised in oil and canvas? Rumors swirled that Charles himself had approved the change. The silence from Buckingham Palace was deafening. Not a single official comment, not a single clarification, just an empty space where a queen should have stood. Camilla, blindsided by the news, reportedly confronted the staff directly. Her voice, usually composed and controlled, broke as she demanded to know how such a decision had been made. One aide later described her as heartbroken, in a way none of us had ever seen before. Behind the closed doors of Clarence House, she wept, not for the portrait alone, but for what it represented. This wasn't just about paint, it was about permanence. Her image, her legacy, had been deliberately excluded from a historical narrative she had fought so hard to be part of. Even as Camilla tried to compose herself, she couldn't ignore the weight of what this exclusion meant. Years of loyalty, reinvention, and public service brushed aside in a single royal order. And the person who had signed off on it? The man she had stood beside for decades. But this portrait was only the beginning. Behind the canvas lay a deeper, more devastating royal decision. Before the public ever saw the portrait, King Charles summoned two of the most trusted and perhaps most influential members of the royal family to Balmoral. It was a meeting not listed in any official diary, a gathering shrouded in the kind of secrecy that signals something more than mere family catch-up. The invitations had been personal, direct, and deliberate. Princess Anne, the unyielding guardian of royal tradition, and Prince Edward, the quiet stabilizer, made their way to the Scottish estate under the guise of a private retreat. But this was no leisurely countryside visit. This was about power, perception, and the very image of the monarchy itself. Notably, Camilla was not invited. Her absence spoke volumes to those who paid attention to such details. For decades, she had been by Charles's side in both public and private affairs. Yet this time, her presence was neither requested nor welcomed. The exclusion was intentional, and it did not go unnoticed by those inside the palace walls. Early speculation whispered through corridors, why would the king discuss matters of legacy without his queen consort? The answer, it seemed, lay in the growing tension between maintaining a modern image and preserving the crown's historic narrative. As the three sat in Balmoral's private drawing room, Anne wasted no time. She pressed for what she called a return to legacy, a recalibration of the monarchy's public face to reflect the deep reverence still held for Queen Elizabeth II and the enduring legacy of Princess Diana. In Anne's view, public trust had to be rooted in familiarity, tradition, and figures whose memory was untainted by controversy. Camilla, though dutiful in recent years, could never be fully separated from the shadow of her past. Anne argued that images matter more than words, and in the age of instant media, a portrait can shape perception for decades. Edward, ever the cautious voice, raised the issue of public backlash. Removing Camilla from the monarchy's visual narrative too suddenly, he warned, could fracture the delicate public unity Charles had been building since his coronation. There were, he insisted, still those who respected her for her service, her steadiness, and her role in supporting the king. A move too abrupt might turn sympathy into resentment. But even Edward's measured caution seemed unable to halt the growing momentum in the room. Charles listened quietly, his expression unreadable, weighing his love for Camilla against the cold, strategic calculus of royal survival. He knew the monarchy was as much about perception as it was about duty. Every image, every symbol carried the weight of history. And the truth he could not ignore was this: the public adored the memory of Diana and revered the reign of Elizabeth. Camilla's presence in the very symbols meant to anchor the monarchy's future could dilute that sentiment, even if it broke his heart to admit it. By the meeting's end, the decision was sealed without fanfare, without any official record. Camilla would be removed from future state imagery, starting with the most anticipated symbol of the new reign, the royal portrait. It was a choice born of political necessity, but steeped in personal cost, and one that would set in motion a chain of events neither side could undo. Camilla may not have been at Balmoral, but she felt the impact of that decision like a royal earthquake. When the final portrait was unveiled in secret at Clarence House, Camilla's world shattered. What she did next left staff stunned, and the royal household scrambling. The room was still when the covering was lifted. No crowd, no press, just a quiet, private moment. But within seconds, the silence collapsed under the weight of betrayal. Camilla stood frozen, eyes locked onto the canvas where she expected to see herself beside Charles, honored as Queen Consort, a pillar of the new royal era. Instead, she saw an absence of hers. Every other face is carefully positioned, every element meticulously designed. Yet, where she once stood during the sitting, there was now empty space, subtly replaced by antique architecture and shadow. It was as if she had never existed in that vision of the monarchy. A palace aide who witnessed the moment would later describe her as pale and trembling, almost in shock. Camilla didn't speak for a long moment. Then, without warning, her composure cracked. The Queen Consort, the woman who had endured decades of scrutiny and scandal, crumbled before the painting. Her eyes filled with tears, not of anger, but of humiliation. This wasn't just an omission. This was erased. And it had been sanctioned from within the very palace she had helped fortify. She demanded to see Charles immediately, bypassing protocol, disregarding timing. Her voice, once soft and careful, carried through the stone corridors of Clarence House with raw emotion. Charles arrived, unaware of the storm awaiting him. Camilla didn't hold back. "How could you?" she asked, voice shaking with disbelief. "I've given you everything, and this is how I'm erased?" There was no tact, no diplomacy, just pain. Decades of loyalty unraveling in a single confrontation. But Charles didn't fight back. He didn't defend. Instead, he offered a quiet, evasive explanation. Something about timing, symbolism, and public image. That the portrait was meant to highlight continuity and the legacy of the crown. Those certain faces resonated more with the nation. That perhaps it was not personal, but strategic. It was meant to reassure the public, to stabilize the monarchy. But the words fell flat. They weren't just hollow, they were cruel in their restraint. Camilla saw it clearly now. This wasn't about strategy, it was about sacrifice. And she was the one offering. What followed was shouting behind closed doors, something rarely heard in Clarence House. Staff, trained to maintain silence and composure, exchanged glances of disbelief. One described the argument as, like watching the fabric of the monarchy tear itself apart. In those moments, Camilla wasn't the Queen Consort. She was a woman who had loved fiercely, given completely, and now stood discarded in the shadows of royal calculation. But while Camilla wept behind palace doors, the public was about to get its first glimpse of the monarch's cold new vision. When the portrait was publicly unveiled at the Royal Gallery, Camilla's absence wasn't just noticed, it sparked a firestorm of controversy across Britain. The moment had been anticipated for weeks, a symbolic unveiling meant to usher in a new era of monarchy. The painting had been promoted as a tribute to continuity and stability under King Charles's reign. Reporters, royal watchers, and loyalists gathered beneath the gilded ceilings, awaiting the grand reveal. But the silence that followed the lift of the curtain was not reverent. It was shocking. Whispers turned into gasps as eyes scanned the composition. Charles stood tall at the center. William and Catherine flanked him. Anne and Edward lingered near the periphery. But the one figure that should have completed the frame, the Queen Consort herself, was missing entirely. Not minimized, not subtly placed. Gone. The press didn't waste a second. Headlines ignited like wildfire. Royal portrait omits Queen Camilla. deliberate erasure, or royal oversight. Social media exploded with speculation, and hashtags like "Where is Camilla?" and "Royal Snub" began trending within hours. The public, already divided on Camilla's role within the monarchy, found themselves pulled into a whirlwind of theories and emotion. Some viewed it as the ultimate humiliation, a betrayal not just of a woman, but of history itself. Others, however, praised the bold move, interpreting it as a return to values long lost, and an unspoken homage to Queen Elizabeth, and, more potently, to Diana. Justice for Diana appeared in comments, op-eds, and tweets, framing Camilla's exclusion not as a loss, but as a correction. Royal commentators stepped into the storm, offering sharp analyses wrapped in coded language. A recalibration, one said, of royal imagery to match public sentiment. Another declared it a strategic soft rebranding, hinting at a behind-the-scenes pivot toward a monarchy that visually distanced itself from recent controversies. Whispers of the Balmoral meeting began to leak into media circles, suggesting this had been planned all along. This wasn't a mistake, it was a message. Camilla, who had once been scheduled to attend the unveiling, was nowhere to be seen. Official palace channels attributed her absence to a private illness, but no further details were offered. And no one believed it. Insiders later revealed that she had declined to attend out of protest, still reeling from the private confrontation days earlier. It wasn't just disappointment, it was grief, the kind that doesn't fade with ceremony or titles. But it wasn't Camilla who faced the outrage. It was the institution. Critics demanded to know what kind of monarchy would sideline its own queen consort in such a public and symbolic act. Was this a palace torn from within? Or was this a carefully executed plan to rewrite the story of the crown one portrait at a time? As the painting's silence spoke volumes, Camilla realized her war for place and purpose had only just begun. Camilla's sudden erasure wasn't just artistic, it felt strategic. And palace insiders began whispering of a royal coup, led by a familiar, iron-willed force. What had begun as a quiet humiliation in a portrait hall quickly evolved into something far more sinister. The omission of Camilla's image wasn't an isolated event. It was, according to the whispers circulating through the palace, merely the first calculated move in a broader scheme. And at the center of this growing suspicion stood Princess Anne, the stoic, unflinching daughter of Queen Elizabeth, long underestimated but never unaware, was now being named in hushed tones as the architect of a quiet reordering within the monarchy. A reordering that did not include Camilla. Behind closed doors, it was said that a monarch's legacy committee had been formed informally, of course, but no less powerful for its secrecy. Its purpose? To reshape the monarchy's narrative, realign the public face of the royal family with the legacy of Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana, and prepare the institution for a generational handover. What shocked many within the walls of Buckingham Palace was not that such a committee existed, but that Camilla, the Queen Consort, had never been invited to join. Rumors grew darker. Camilla began to believe that Anne wasn't acting alone, that she and Catherine were quietly but methodically transforming the monarchy's female image from within. Where Camilla had once been the face of quiet resilience, she now feared she was being replaced by a newer, cleaner symbol of regal femininity. Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, soon to be queen in spirit, if not in name. And while Charles remained the head of state, he had begun to drift, not emotionally, but politically. His meetings became more frequent, more private. Camilla was no longer included in the daily rhythm of strategy and state. Instead, William and Anne now sat where she once stood. Then came the leaked notes. Phrases like "public affection must align with institutional legacy" and "optics over obligation" appeared in meeting memos that somehow slipped into the hands of senior aides loyal to Camilla. The language was clinical, calculated, and devastating. It confirmed what she had feared. This wasn't a mistake, it was a movement. And she was the casualty. She confronted Charles again, but this time, it was different. There was no shouting, no emotional display, just a quiet, desperate attempt to be heard, to be seen. But Charles offered nothing in return. Not comfort, not denial, just silence. The same heavy silence that had preceded the portrait, the same silence that had shadowed Balmoral, and the same silence that now filled every room she entered. It wasn't indifference, it was dismissal. He had already made his choice, or worse, had allowed others to make it for him. As Camilla watched her influence evaporate, One royal figure was quietly rising, and the crown's weight was shifting with her. While Camilla mourned the portrait, Catherine stepped into the spotlight without ever asking for it. And the timing couldn't have been more devastating. The state banquet was meant to be ceremonial, another polished performance in a royal calendar full of tradition. But one detail turned the event into a defining moment. A passing of the torch, not by declaration, but by symbolism. When Catherine arrived wearing Diana's iconic sapphire tiara, the very same piece Camilla had once been permitted to wear during her brief ascension as Queen Consort, the message rang louder than any speech. It was unmistakable. The monarchy had chosen its new symbol, and it wasn't the woman who had stood beside Charles for nearly 2 decades. It was the one who carried Diana's legacy with quiet grace and unshakable public affection. The moment was televised across the nation, and within minutes, comparisons flooded social media and morning newsrooms alike. The People's Princess Reborn, Diana's spirit returns. Every camera angle, every photo, every carefully chosen word from royal spokespeople fueled the narrative. This wasn't a coincidence. It was choreography. And while Catherine never sought the limelight in this way, the palace had positioned her as its radiant future, and Camilla as its fading past. At Clarence House, Camilla was said to have watched the broadcast in silence, her hands clenched tightly together, the hurt settling deep in her chest. She didn't need the public's commentary to understand what had just happened. A royal signal had been sent, and she was no longer in it. It wasn't just a tiara. It was erasure draped in diamonds and symbolism. The very emblem she had once believed marked her acceptance into royal legacy now shimmered atop another's head, dazzling the world as if it had always belonged there. William, who had once publicly supported Camilla's role out of respect for his father, was now firmly aligned with the future. Behind closed doors, he had reportedly endorsed the decision to pass the tiara to Catherine. A new era, he told Charles, a new symbol. And Charles, stoic, weary, and increasingly pragmatic, had agreed without hesitation. Desperate for clarity, Camilla confronted Charles one final time. Not in rage, but in quiet implosion. "Don't make me invisible," she whispered. The plea came not from a queen, but from a woman who had watched her relevance stripped away piece by piece. But Charles, now hardened by legacy and trapped by duty, offered only a cold, measured response. "History remembers symbols," he said, "not scandals." In those 5 words, Camilla heard everything. She wasn't part of the history he wanted to remember. But Camilla wouldn't go down quietly. What she did next sent shockwaves through every royal corridor. When a handwritten letter from Queen Camilla was leaked to the press, Buckingham Palace entered full crisis mode. In it, she exposed more than just her pain. The letter wasn't meant for public eyes. It was raw, emotional, and filled with the kind of vulnerability the palace has spent generations suppressing. Written in Camilla's own hand and sent to a longtime confidant of a woman she had known before titles, before scandal, before crown, the contents were deeply personal. But somewhere along its journey, someone intervened, and within days, the letter found its way to the front pages of the British press. The monarchy's last remaining illusion of unity shattered before breakfast. In the letter, Camilla didn't mince words. "I was promised permanence," she wrote. "Now I am a placeholder in a house I helped rebuild." The statement hit harder than any public interview or prepared address ever could. She had always known her presence in the royal family came with a price. But now, it seemed, she was paying in full with interest. The letter spoke of betrayal not just from the institution, but from within. It accused certain royals of orchestrating her slow, methodical exclusion from public life and royal symbolism. Though no names were mentioned directly, the allusions were unmistakable. Anne, Catherine, perhaps even William. And behind it all, Charles is silent, complicit, or worse. The public reaction was swift and divisive. Some sympathized, finally seeing the Queen Consort as a woman abandoned by the very man she stood by through global condemnation and private disgrace. Others, however, saw the moment as poetic justice. Headlines read, "Camilla's crown cracks," while social media platforms lit up with cold sarcasm. "This is karma." One post read, "Diana never needed to write a letter because we already knew her truth." Camilla had tried to rewrite her role in royal history, but this letter proved the ink was never hers to hold. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood turned from discomfort to sheer panic. Charles, caught off guard by the leak, reportedly demanded to know who had access to the letter and how it had been compromised. But the damage was done. The story had legs, and it was sprinting through every major news outlet in Europe. Senior staff were ordered into round-the-clock PR strategy sessions, desperately trying to patch the fractures before they became unfixable. Yet, the public wasn't interested in statements or spin. They wanted answers. And then, in the midst of the chaos, came a quiet comment from Princess Anne to one of her aides. The truth always finds a way out. It wasn't said for microphones or headlines, but it echoed louder than any palace press release. Whether it was a defense of Camilla or a dismissal of her claims remained a mystery, but the sentiment stuck. With her emotions laid bare and loyalty questioned, Camilla's grip on her role began to slip, and the consequences would be irreversible. A second portrait was quietly unveiled weeks later. This time, it wasn't just about who was missing, but who was standing where. Unlike the grand reveal that had set the nation ablaze with questions, this unveiling was discreet. No press, no fanfare, no statement. But the silence made it even more deafening. The painting was hung within the halls of Windsor Castle, in a corridor historically reserved for generational lineage, monarchs and heirs, kings and queens, legacy and permanence. And yet, in this newly unveiled piece, meant to reflect the modern monarchy, there was no Camilla. Not a silhouette, not a symbol, not a single nod to her existence. It was as if history had hit the delete button on her chapter. Charles stood at the center once again, draped in royal authority. To his right, William stoic, future-bound. To his left, Catherine glowing, steady, unmistakably iconic. And just behind them, standing with quiet power, was Princess Anne, the traditionalist, who now seemed to represent something far more contemporary. But the true dagger was hidden deeper. In the blurred background, hanging behind them within the portrait itself, was another painting, Princess Diana. Her image lingered like a ghost, framed in soft light, her presence subtle but deliberate. Diana's legacy had been restored, not just in memory, but in framing the future. The message wasn't lost on anyone who saw it. Royal historians and commentators didn't hesitate to interpret the composition. This was a monarchy reborn as a post-Camilla monarchy, as one analyst boldly declared. It wasn't just a redirection of focus. It was a visual rewriting of the last 2 decades. A quiet admission that Camilla's era had been tolerated, not embraced. That it had served a purpose, but would not be remembered. And for a woman who had sacrificed so much to claw her way into public acceptance, that truth was soul-crushing. Camilla reportedly saw the portrait in private, alone. The moment was not recorded, but sources close to her say it marked a turning point, an emotional collapse from which she never fully recovered. She withdrew from scheduled appearances, citing fatigue. Though insiders whispered of something far heavier, those closest to her say she stopped engaging with palace staff, declined meetings, and spent long hours isolated in the upper floors of Clarence House, avoiding even Charles. The woman once branded as resilient had become a ghost in her own kingdom. Within days, rumors surfaced of her contemplating a retreat from royal life altogether. Not an abdication, there was no crown to surrender, but an emotional resignation. Discussions were allegedly held behind closed doors about quietly reducing her public engagements, shifting her duties elsewhere, perhaps even orchestrating a dignified fade from the limelight. What had begun as a symbolic shift was now manifesting as a very real fracture, one the palace couldn't hide behind art or protocol. And just when it seemed the portraits had spoken their final word, King Charles made one last decision that changed everything. In an unannounced midnight decree, King Charles stunned the nation by formally redefining Camilla's title, signaling the end of their public union. There had been whispers for weeks. The tension was visible, the silence deafening, and Camilla's absence at official engagements increasingly difficult to explain away. But nothing could have prepared even the most seasoned royal insiders for what came next. Without warning, without consultation beyond a small circle of aides, King Charles signed a private royal decree under the cover of night. Its contents, once leaked to a trusted journalist, rippled through the United Kingdom like thunder. The decree, brief yet seismic in its language, declared that Camilla would retain her title in private as a mark of respect, but would no longer be referred to as Queen Consort in any official royal communication, state documentation, or ceremonial proceedings. The move was not a legal demotion. It was, in effect, A symbolic burial. A quiet rewriting of her place within the monarchy's hierarchy. Her name, her title, her position removed from the front-facing royal identity just as her image had been erased from the portraits. The royal court was thrown into chaos. Advisors scrambled to understand the implications, historians debated its precedent, and the public stood split once more. For some, it was seen as an overdue correction, a final nod to legacy, loyalty, and lineage. For others, it felt cruel, unnecessary, and deeply personal. But in every circle, one thing was clear. The king had spoken. Not with rage, not with scandal, but with quiet, irreversible finality. Camilla's reaction was not made public, but insiders revealed that she collapsed in tears upon learning of the decree. She reportedly refused all contact for several days, rejecting calls, declining appearances, and ultimately refusing to attend any future state ceremonies. Her identity, carefully rebuilt over decades, had been stripped in a single stroke. Not by the press, not by protesters, but by the man she had stood beside through firestorms and coronations. When Charles finally addressed the public, his statement was cold and calculated. The crown must reflect the soul of the nation. No names, no explanations. Just an echoing truth that left no room for interpretation. It was the end of an era, a decision made not in haste, but in the slow unraveling of loyalty and legacy. William and Catherine, said to be quietly informed ahead of the decree, offered no public comment. But their increased presence in royal affairs in the days following told its own story. The future was here, and Camilla was not in it. In the following weeks, Camilla quietly retreated to Ray Mill House, her private estate, and final connection to a life before the crown. A place untouched by palace politics, a place where she was simply Camilla, not a title, not a controversy, not a footnote in someone else's legend. And so, behind palace gates and brushstrokes, the monarchy was rewritten one portrait at a time. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.